Turning Tides is an Antiks entertainment production. You can find the show on social media at the Turning Tides Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube, and at Turning Tides Pod on Bluesky and Mastodon. For more information, or if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or collaborating, please contact us at the Turning Tides Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you. Warning. This episode of Turning Tides contains depictions of murder, sexual assault, war, violence, torture, child abuse, suicide, and genocide.
The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it. The second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 25. Emperor Heraclius had come a long way. From the shores of North Africa to the great capital of Constantinople and through the mountains of modern-day Turkey, he had fought many battles and won many victories. He now stood before Jerusalem, a city he knew as Aelia Capitolina, bearing a wooden cross on his back. He was not literally being crucified. He carried the cross of Christ through the streets of the holy city. Legend has it that Heraclius was initially barred from entry from the city by an invisible wall. Puzzled, he realized that in order to carry the cross into the city, he could not be wearing the refinements and luxuries of high office. He removed his regal attire and fancy shoes. It was only then that the invisible barrier was lifted, and the barefoot emperor of the Byzantines was able to walk through the city streets. He then placed the cross in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in celebration of the defeat of the Sassanids and their Jewish Palestinian allies. When Emperor Hadrian died in 138 B.C.E., he was mourned by almost no one. The Roman Senate despised him, so upon the emperor's death, they refused to deify him. The Jewish peoples of the Roman world utterly reviled the former emperor. There is not a mention of the emperor in Hebrew documents that does not follow with the phrase, quote, "May his bones rot in hell," unquote. Aelia Capitolina, Jerusalem, was a shell of its former self. Fewer than 10,000 people lived there. Caesarea on the coast, or as it was most commonly known, Caesarea Palestine, as well as the port city of Gaza, became Palestine's most populous cities. In fact, Masalha asserts that the two cities maintained a friendly rivalry and attempted to outdo one another in trade and cultural output. Caesarea Palestine had a flourishing cultural life, while Gaza was home to a world-renowned school of rhetoric, in which many early Christian thinkers learned a litany of useful skills designed to make them adept administrators and theologians for the Byzantine Roman state. This era is usually glossed over, but the Romans were the polity which maintained political control of Palestine for the longest period of time comparative to any other nation. As a result, Roman customs and architecture, as well as Latin words, remain deeply ingrained in modern-day Palestinian life. During this time, Palestine became a majority Christian country, while also maintaining a sizable minority of Jewish, Samaritan, and pagan believers. In spite of the population growth in the greater Palestine area, the rest of the Roman Empire was in a state of perpetual chaos and disorder. Marcus Aurelius is considered by many to be one of the last quote-unquote stable Roman emperors. The Stoic philosopher-king spent most of his long reign putting down uprisings in the distant corners of the empire, while also pushing back quote-unquote barbarian incursions along the borders of Germania. In all of these endeavors, he was generally successful. He traveled through Palestine only once during his long reign. While he was there, he actively complained about the rebelliousness of the Jewish Palestinian people. He writes, quote, "O Qadi, O Sarmatians, at last I have found a people more unruly than you." Unquote. Jewish believers were still formally banned from Aelia Capitolina, although they were allowed to circumcise their children, as well as pray on the Mount of Olives. Around this time, the 2nd century CE, Judah Hanasi became one of the most influential and well-known Jewish believers in the Roman world. He was ennobled by multiple Roman emperors. They granted the rabbi large tracts of land in Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. Hanasi is also responsible for composing the Mishnah, a crucial work discussing Jewish theology. During this era, Roman hatred for Jewish believers largely pivoted to the early Christian communities, which were gaining strength all across the Roman world. In numerous instances, early Christians became martyrs for their faith. In spite of their persecution, the steady conversion of Christianity continued. In 235, Emperor Alexander Severus was murdered while campaigning in southwestern Asia. This ignited 30 years of chaos. Remembered as the era of the 30 tyrants, this epoch was defined by a hodgepodge of Roman polities, all run by various strongmen fighting over land and resources. In the east, the former Parthian Empire was also in a state of upheaval. A man named Ardashir of Sassan destroyed the Parthians and became the first sovereign of the Sassanid Empire. He asserted that he was a descendant of Cyrus the Great. His geopolitical dream was to recreate the long-gone Achaemenid Persian or Iranian Empire. He set about taking the land which the monarch Cyrus had usurped. Ardashir was generally successful in these endeavors. First, he took over the Massagetae as well as other tribes located in Central Asia. Additionally, he captured lands which bordered the Indian subcontinent. In the west, he attempted to reassert Persian supremacy over the Kingdom of Armenia, which was a Roman client state at this point. This brought the two great empires into a conflict which would rage for several centuries, only ending with the rise of the early Islamic caliphs. In modern-day Syria, an Arabic ruler named Odenathus, who maintained nominal vassalship to Rome, began forming a large kingdom. Remembered as the Palmyrene Empire, it was a polity which stretched from modern-day Turkey to the borders of modern-day Sudan. Odenathus employed shock cavalry tactics to compensate for his lack of manpower. These same tactics would be used by Muslim generals in the 7th and 8th centuries to form an even larger empire. While the main enemies of Palmyra were the Sassanids to the east, they also harbored intense animosity for the Goths who were inhabiting the Ukrainian steppe during this time. The Goths launched numerous naval raids against Odenathus's realm. He responded by crushing the Gothic sea raiders. He also killed one of the 30 tyrants of Rome. This earned him the admiration of the floundering emperors of Rome. Following his campaign against the Goths, however, he was murdered, and his territory was officially passed into the hands of his 10-year-old son, Vabalathus. Unofficially, however, the realm was in the hands of the boy's mother, the queen regent of Palmyra, Zenobia. Culturally and ethnically, the Palmyran Empire was made up of both Eastern and Western political traditions and trends. For example, Zenobia and her son took the titles of both Augusti and King of Kings. The empire was composed of Arabs, Romans, Greeks, Palestinians, Syrians, and many other ethnic groups. In 270, Zenobia invaded Roman Arabia and murdered the Roman governor there. This began the Palmyrene Rebellion. Next, she ordered her top generals to invade Egypt, and in a lightning campaign of destruction, they usurped all the land the Romans had originally stolen. In 271, her armies invaded Turkey, where they were finally held up about halfway through the Anatolian Peninsula. In Rome, a measure of stability was found under a series of emperors known for their Western Balkan ethnic heritage. The second of these quote-unquote Illyrian emperors, Aurelian, made a concerted effort to put down the Eastern Rebellion, which threatened to destabilize the empire. In a series of risky marches and battles, Aurelian subdued the Palmyrene. Zenobia and her child were brought to Rome in chains and were put on display at Aurelian's triumph. Some accounts describe the emperor pardoning Zenobia and keeping her under house arrest in the city of Rome, where her house became a tourist attraction. Palmyra was ravaged, its riches were looted, and its administrators and bureaucrats were executed and replaced with loyal Roman lapdogs. Zenobia's influence on Palestine is hard to discern. Some Christian writers have claimed she was Jewish, while Jewish sources assert she was a, quote, haughty ruler, unquote, who did no favors for the Jewish people. Considering only Christian sources claim she was Jewish, there is no way to verify the integrity of these claims. In all likelihood, this theory is incorrect. Overall, it seems the people of Palestine were largely averse to her rule. This makes sense, as the true centers of power in Palestine were along the coast, and these areas likely suffered economic hardship as a result of Zenobia's uprising. The Palmyrene Empire's legacy remains elusive, but modern-day Syrian scholars like Philip Hitti assert that Zenobia's revolt was one of the first examples of, quote, proto-Pan-Arabism, unquote. Throughout the late 3rd century, Roman emperors of varying skill came and went, usually only serving as Augusti for a few years. This was the case until the rise of Diocletian. Diocletian is remembered as one of the great politicians of the Roman state. He ranks alongside Octavian in terms of his political acumen and skills of manipulation and persuasion. Unlike Octavian, who laid the foundation for the empire, Diocletian ensured the empire would split apart. Before that happened, he remodeled the empire in order to make the Roman state more efficient. This included instituting administrative and military reforms. The most crucial of these reforms was in regards to the future of the empire. He decreed that upon his abdication and retirement, the empire would be split amongst 2 Augusti and 4 Caesars, in a system designed to ensure that no one could assert ultimate control. Besides his plans for the future of Rome, his rule was defined by a crackdown on the Christian religion, which continued to grow in spite of the Roman state's persecution. By this point, around 6 million people in the empire followed the Christian faith. In 305, Diocletian abdicated the throne in the hopes of living out his retirement as a farmer. He would live just long enough to realize how terrible his plans for Rome were. Upon his death in 311 or 312, Rome fell into disrepair and civil war. In the west, the legions declared Constantine the emperor. In the east, Maxentius had been in open rebellion for years. The 2 armies met at Milvian Bridge in modern-day Italy to decide the future of the empire. Allegedly, Constantine saw the original symbol of Christianity, the Chi-Rho, shining in the night sky before the battle. Underneath this symbol were the Latin words, in hoc signo vinces, which translates to, by this sign you will conquer. Constantine took the sign in the sky seriously, and ordered his soldiers to adorn the Chi-Rho upon their shields. For those unfamiliar, the Chi-Rho resembles a capital letter P with a capital letter X running through it. Constantine also swore that if he won, he would become a Christian. In the ensuing battle, despite being vastly outnumbered, Constantine destroyed Maxentius's army, drowning Maxentius and tens of thousands of Romans in the process. Ultimately, it would take Constantine another 11 years of battle with his political enemies before he became the undisputed leader of the Roman Empire. One of his first decrees was to build an entirely new capital on top of the site of a small Greek town named Byzantium. Constantine's new capital would come to be called Constantinople, after the Roman emperor, while the quote-unquote Eastern Empire would come to be known as the Byzantine Empire. Upon seizing control, Constantine tried to regulate the Christian religion. During the 4th century, there were several Christian sects which all vied for ideological dominance in the new faith. The main debate within the Christian community was about the level of divinity which Jesus Christ held. Some argued he was more divine than man. Others claimed he was more man than God. In order to clear up the matter, Constantine called the Council of Nicaea, in which the nature of Christ was agreed upon by early Christian thinkers. They asserted that Jesus was simultaneously a man, a God, and a Holy Spirit. This doctrine was reasserted in 381 under the rule of Emperor Theodosius. Christian Palestinians made up a large portion of these two councils' memberships. Most Christian Palestinians resided in Caesarea on the coast, but there were also flourishing Christian communities in cities like Gaza, Ascalon, and Aelia Capitolina. The Council of Nicaea also asserted the independent rights of the Palestinian Church in Jerusalem as, quote, first among equals, unquote. This gave a large measure of autonomy to the churches in Palestine and allowed for the growth of monastic culture in the coming centuries. This culture was upheld and tolerated throughout the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid caliphates. It only dissipated when the quote-unquote Crusader states of Palestine were forced out of southwestern Asia by Sultan Saladin. This did not mean that Christians stopped living in Palestine. On the contrary, Christians would make up a disproportionate percentage of the members of local Muslim governments and administrations. They would also be one of the first to feel the effects of Zionism, due to the fact that they largely lived in urban centers, which were the first to be invaded by the settler colonizers. Today, churches are forced to hold Easter Mass on lockdown by the Israeli state. Statues of Jesus are smashed and vandalized by the IDF, and Catholic nuns are beaten in the streets. Throughout this time, there is ample evidence that the spread of the Jewish religion continued. This occurred in spite of the rise of the Christian religion as the state religion of Rome. Constantine and his progeny waged a war on the Jewish religion, especially on those who converted. Shlomo Sand writes, quote, a Jewish person who circumcised his slave was condemned to death. Owning a Christian slave became punishable by the confiscation of property. Any harm done to a Christianized Jewish person was punished by burning at the stake. By contrast, new proselytes, if there were still any, risked losing all their property, unquote. There were also attempts by Constantine to placate the Jewish population of Palestine. At some point during his reign, Gudrun Kramer asserts that Constantine allowed Jewish believers to occasionally return to Aelia Capitolina and pray at what was believed to be the remnants of the Second Temple, remembered as the Wailing or Western Wall. Besides the military, administrative, and theological reforms, Constantine also wanted to increase the architectural prestige of the Christian religion while debasing all others. In Aelia Capitolina, he ordered the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on top of the site where Hadrian had once built a massive temple to Jupiter. The church's construction would take 10 years, but by 336, the Holy Sepulchre was open for worship. The church's architect, Helena, made a point not to build on the site of the Second Temple. She did not do this out of reverence or respect. Instead, she turned the site of the Second Temple into a garbage dump, where the city's refuse was tossed. This was done to, quote, mock the Jewish God, unquote, and prove the, quote, superiority of Christ, unquote. The rest of Constantine's reign was defined by court intrigues and familial killings. His first son was accused of raping his stepmother, and he was executed by Constantine. Then Constantine killed his wife after being convinced that the rape was actually a consensual affair. Constantine would celebrate his 30th year of rule in Aelia Capitolina but his empire was beset by domestic and foreign political issues. Quote-unquote barbarians, who were largely fleeing persecution and violence in the east, often tried to pass over the borders of the empire, violently when necessary, while internally, the secession crisis remained an ever-present threat. Besides all this, internal uprisings were more and more commonplace. This was the case in Palestine, where numerous Jewish and Samaritan uprisings were ruthlessly crushed by the Roman military. The successors of Constantine the Great were lackluster and more concerned with growing their own personal power than maintaining the Roman Empire. They fought constant civil wars with each other, while their border provinces were slowly falling into the hands of a variety of Germanic, Slavic, and Eurasian tribes. Constantius, son of Constantine, had managed to outlive his other two brothers. He was in a life-or-death struggle for supremacy with an upstart Roman general who had managed to gain the allegiance of the Western Empire. Constantius would win the war when the Roman population of Italy and Gaul revolted against the general. Constantius now had another problem. He was in over his head when it came to managing this vast realm. He appointed his cousin, Julian, to rule the West, while he maintained his imperium in the east. Constantius probably hoped that the bookish, awkward, and soft-spoken Julian would meekly submit to whatever he decreed, but Julian proved he was no pushover. Within 2 years, Julian had subdued all of Gaul, which had been in open rebellion for years. In the Eastern Empire, Constantius had his hands full with Shapur II, King of Kings of the Sassanid Empire. The two rulers had already fought in an inconclusive war, and after Shapur shored up his eastern provinces, he turned his armies west and invaded the Roman satellite state of Armenia in 358. Constantius and his forces fought numerous bloody battles with the Iranians. Both sides were utterly worn out by the fighting and campaigning. Constantius needed reinforcements, so he ordered his cousin Julian to send his best legions in support of the Persian wars. Julian attempted to comply, but his legions refused to serve under anyone but their emperor. They declared Julian the sole Augusti of Rome and marched east to confront Constantius. In November of 361, Emperor Julian formally renounced Christianity and took up pagan worship of the Roman pantheon of gods once more. This earned him the ire of Christian theologians, who refer to Julian with open contempt as, quote, the apostate, unquote. Moving with his army to confront Constantius, he received news that his cousin had died, leaving him as the sole emperor of the two halves of the empire. In late July of 362, he formally rescinded the anti-Jewish laws and taxes which had been passed by previous Christian emperors. Jewish people were allowed back into Aelia Capitolina. Beyond this, Julian swore to rebuild their temple and allow them to worship peacefully as they had done before its destruction. Finally, he gave autonomy to the Jewish people in Palestine by granting the power of taxation to a local Jewish dignitary named Hillel. Julian did not do all this because he was some sort of reformer. He did it as a calculated maneuver in order to gain several things. First, he wanted to embarrass the Christian religion. Second, he wanted to clearly delineate his rule from the murderous rule of his uncle Constantine. Finally, he wanted to gain the support of Babylonian Jewish practitioners in the hopes that they would assist him in his upcoming invasion of Persia. In Palestine, the construction of Julian's temple was enthusiastically supported by the Jewish population there. They collected materials and employed master masons for the job. In May of 363, Palestine suffered a devastating earthquake, which somehow ignited the building materials which had been painstakingly acquired. In all likelihood, the fire may have been an arson, which would have likely been committed by the Christian population of Aelia, who could have used the earthquake as a screen for their vandalism. Unsure of how to proceed, the builder placed in charge of the project decided to wait for Julian's return from the Persian front. Julian would never return. Following a series of victories against the Iranians, Julian managed to capture Ctesiphon, but during a nighttime skirmish, he was mortally wounded. Allegedly, Julian was pierced in the side by a spear, in the same fashion as Jesus. Attempting to remove the spear, Julian tore the sinews in his hand. Recognizing the irony of his final moments, Julian supposedly shouted, quote, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean," unquote, in reference to Jesus. Upon Julian's death, Christianity was restored, the anti-Jewish laws and taxes began anew, and Jewish people were banned from entering Aelia Capitolina again, relegated to visiting only once a year. Jerome the Illyrian wrote about their plight with outright contempt. He states that in the 380s, quote, "Those faithless people who killed the servant of God, that mob of wretches congregates, and, while the church of the resurrection glows, and the banner of his cross shines forth from the Mount of Olives, those miserable people groan over the ruins of the temple. A soldier asks for money to allow them to weep a little longer," unquote. Beginning in the middle of the 4th century, the Roman procutorial province of Syria Palestina was officially split into 3 separate provinces. These were Palestina Prima, whose capital was Caesarea Palestinae, Palestina Secunda, whose capital was Beisan, and Palestina Salutaris, renamed Palestina Tertia at the start of the 5th century, whose capital was located at Petra. This began the era of the 3 Palestines, or Greater Palestine. These 3 provinces were meant to literally represent the 3 incarnations of Christ. Although they made decisions independently of one another, they relied heavily on each other for common defense and trade. Palestina Prima was undoubtedly the largest and most economically prosperous of the 3. The other 2 Palestines were much smaller. They relied on the coastal cities of Gaza and Caesarea for imports, while the coastal cities relied on the smaller 2 Palestines for foodstuffs and exportable goods. Overall, the 3 Palestines were governed militarily by the Deus Palestinae, or the military commander of Palestine. Additionally, the 3 Palestines were governed ecclesiastically by the Palestine Patriarchate of Aelia Capitolina. Throughout this period, famous theologians and well-known Christian philosophers were born in the 3 Palestines, and they produced important works discussing Christian reason, history, and thought. These philosophers included Origen, Eusebius, and Procopius of Caesarea Palestinae, as well as Procopius of Gaza. According to Nur Masalha, it was largely due to these early church fathers that a, quote, "distinct Palestinian religio-cultural identity," unquote, began to form and develop amongst the native Palestinian people. Linguistically, the administration and the upper classes used Koine Greek, while the majority of the peasants likely spoke Aramaic, as opposed to Hebrew, which was rarely used at this point. Meanwhile, in the deserts and hills of Palestine, monks, priests, and nuns were transforming the countryside into a patchwork of monasteries and churches, which revolutionized monastic culture in the area. These men and women were remembered as the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers. Nur Masalha states, quote, "They had a major influence on the development of Christianity and Christian monasticism worldwide," unquote. Besides their advancements in theology, they were instrumental in continuing the ancient Palestinian art of winemaking. These desert fathers and mothers shunned ecclesiastical power and preferred to live solitary lives in prayer, poverty, and contemplation. Monasteries evolved along 2 lines. They were either monasteries for hermits, or they were communal monasteries for monks. The most famous of these is the Mar Saba Monastery, which is one of the oldest continuously inhabited and operated monasteries in the world. Another example of a famous Palestinian monastery, which is unfortunately no longer standing, is the Euthemius Monastery. Today, the ruins of the Christian holy site are a part of an Israeli colony in the West Bank. This colony is built nearly on top of the Palestinian Bedouin village of Al-Khan al-Amar, named after an ancient trading post of the same name. Since 2010, the small village has been in the sights of Zionist Israeli colonizers. In 2023, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that any decision on Al-Khan al-Amar had to be postponed for quote-unquote security reasons, and because it would reflect poorly on Israel's, quote, foreign relations, unquote. Not to mention, it would be a war crime in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Not that anyone seems to care about committing war crimes anymore. Back in the 4th century, Arabic Christians began moving to Palestine in great numbers. This included many Hassanids, who maintained a semi-independent kingdom in Palestina Secunda. They were largely monophysites, which meant they believed Christ had only one nature. Therefore, he could only be either man or God, not both. The presence of Arabic people in Palestine and along the entire Levantine littoral was not novel. We have already discussed in our second episode, Kings, how an Arab warrior nearly killed Alexander the Great during the siege of Gaza. Several authorities on the subject also believe the Idumeans were Arabic. This would explain why Herod the Great's brother was named Faisal, a traditionally Arabic name. During the 3rd century CE, a Roman emperor remembered as Philip the Arab was of Arabic origin by way of Syria. Finally, the Palmyrene Empire was largely Arabic. All of these examples point to the fact that Arab people have always been a part of the history of Eurasia, regardless of any Zionist propaganda that says otherwise. The Byzantines invited Arab people into Palestine and the greater Levantine littoral largely as a means of security. Starting in the 4th century and until the 7th century Muslim takeover, Arab Christian Palestinians governed parts of Palestine as semi-autonomous rulers of the land. They maintained loyalty and allegiance to the emperor in Constantinople, but the phylarchs of the 3 Palestines also conducted diplomacy in their own names. Arab tribes were often invited into Palestine as foderati, a term denoting peoples who were not Roman citizens, but were allowed and even encouraged to settle in the Roman provinces. All these phylarchs owed their allegiance to a single leading phylarch, or king, who in turn answered directly to the emperor. Byzantine patronage allowed Hassanid Arabs to consolidate their power in Palestine, Phoenicia, and Syria. In turn, Hassanids allowed for the emperors in Constantinople to focus on threats closer to home. The Hassanids were in a constant battle for local supremacy with the Lakhmids of modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. During this time, Roman Palestine reached the peak of its economic power and had a population of at least 1 million people. When we include the rest of Greater Palestine, the population was likely over 1.5 million. In the words of Masalha, Byzantine and Greek Christians, alongside Samaritans, quote, dominated the central region of Palestine Prima, while Christian Hassanid Arabs and Nabatean Arabs dominated Palestina Secunda and Palestina Tertia, respectively. Unquote. In 438, Empress Eudocia arrived in Jerusalem, and she began relaxing many of the harsh laws against Jewish Palestinians. She was a former pagan, so she understood the harsh realities under which religious minorities had to live in the Christianized Roman Empire. Her husband, Theodosius II, was largely at the mercy of his sister, Pulcheria. She was the one who truly controlled the Eastern Empire and maintained the state, in spite of constant issues with barbarian tribes, as well as the elusive empire of the Huns. Eudocia maintained her support for religious minorities, and while she was in Palestine, she rebuilt Jerusalem's walls for the first time in 4 centuries. In the empire, turbulence over the true nature of Christ began again. Monophysites and their rival Diophysites, who believed Jesus could be both man and a god, fought in the streets over the real interpretation of Christianity. In 451, during the Council of Chalcedon, they decided on the, quote, union of the two natures, unquote. This compromise asserted that Jesus was both a man and a god, and that he maintained both roles perfectly. Another key aspect of the Council of Chalcedon was the confirmation of the autonomous status of the Palestinian Church. Aelia Capitolina joined Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch as one of the 5 members of the Pentarchy. In time, the differences between the Pentarch of Rome and the Eastern Pentarchs would cause another rupture in the Christian religion. The Pentarch of Rome, or Pope, would elevate himself to the head of the Catholic religion in the late 7th century, while Coptic Christians, who rejected the verdict at Chalcedon, began their own church in North Africa, where they remain a religious minority to this day. In the West, the encroachments of various tribal peoples whittled away the strength of the Western Empire. In response, the Western Augusti moved the capital of the empire to Ravenna, a more defensible city in northeastern Italy. Additionally, Western emperors became increasingly reliant on the same tribal peoples to defend their state. Romanized barbarians made significant contributions to the continuation of the Western Empire, largely making up the spine of the Roman state and army. In spite of their noted contributions, most Western Romans considered the Romanized barbarians to be disloyal at best and saboteurs or spies at worst. This racism created an internal decay within the Roman state. When Roman barbarian generals and statesmen began to be assassinated by their ungrateful overlords, future generations would learn that it was incredibly dangerous to be an enemy of Rome, but it was even more dangerous to be Rome's ally. In spite of the racist, uneducated, drug-fueled ramblings of Elon Musk, the reality of the situation in the Western Empire is clear. Western Rome fell because of hatred and racism towards migrants, who did the job of defending the empire much better than the Romans of that era ever did. It did not fall because of a, quote, declining birth rate, unquote. Throughout the late 400s, mercenaries in Roman employ frequently revolted in the hopes of seizing power. In 476, Rome was sacked by Odoacer, ending the Western Empire. Rome would limp on in the east, first with the Byzantines and then with the Ottoman Empire, who actively asserted that they were the Caesari Rum, or the Caesars of Rome. This means that the Roman Empire continued, in some form or fashion, until 1918. In the East, a measure of stability was found due to the administrative abilities and military prowess of emperors like Leo I and Zeno. Both ruled for decades, and they prevented any serious loss of eastern territory. In 518, Justin became the new Basileus, or Emperor of the East. The true power, however, was wielded by his nephew Justinian, who was officially raised to emperor in 527. One of his first official decrees was to change the laws of the empire so that he would be able to marry his longtime mistress, Theodora. Many argue that Theodora was the real power behind Justinian's machinations, and it's undeniable that her iron will was a great asset in managing the empire. As Theodora and Justinian ruled in Constantinople, they dispatched their top general, Belisarius, to reconquer the West. He was incredibly successful, and with only meager armies, he took Italy, North Africa, and southern Spain. In Constantinople, the couple ruled through violence, fear, and opulence. Their heavy-handed tactics usually worked, but in 532, the Nika, or Victory Uprising, exploded in Constantinople. These uprisings were organized by the city's 2 chariot teams, the Greens and Blues, who also acted as one of the few outlets for the people's political discontent. The uprising began in response to immense taxation and brutality in Justinian's state. Justinian was prepared to flee the capital and regroup elsewhere, but Theodora flat out refused. Palestinian historian Procopius claims she said, quote, "In my opinion, flight is not the right course, even if it should bring us to safety. It is impossible for a person, having been born into this world, not to die. But for one who has reigned, it is intolerable to be a fugitive. May I never be deprived of this purple robe, and may I never see the day when those who meet me do not call me Empress. If you wish to save yourself, my lord, there is no difficulty. We are rich. Over there is the sea, and yonder are the ships. Yet reflect for a moment whether, when you have once escaped to a place of security, you would not gladly exchange such safety for death. As for me, I agree with the adage that royal purple is the noblest shroud." Unquote. Justinian had no choice but to remain, and he hurriedly called his generals back to the city. Once they returned, their soldiers slaughtered over 30,000 of the Nika revolutionaries, resulting in the uprising's suppression. Besides his depredations against his own people, Justinian cracked down on Judaism like never before. He demoted the religion so that its practice was no longer quote-unquote permitted, as it was under the Roman Empire of the past. He also banned Passover if it occurred prior to Easter. Finally, he ordered the baptism of many Jewish believers, while he destroyed synagogues and repurposed them as churches. In 537, Justinian opened the Church of Hagia Sophia. As he dedicated it to God, he stated, quote, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Unquote. In 543, Theodora and Justinian began constructing the new Church of St. Mary, Mother of God, in Aelia Capitolina. The church was adorned with the original candelabra captured by Titus in 70 CE, which was usurped by Belisarius when he was campaigning in North Africa. Around the time of the new church's completion, Empress Theodora died, likely from cancer. Throughout this time, Palestine's economy developed as a result of being in the middle of vast Roman trade networks. Cities like Gaza flourished as an entrepot, with Greek travelers recognizing that, quote, through Gaza they could reach India, unquote. This was in reference to Gaza being the southernmost port before the African continent's border. Gaza's rival city, Caesarea Palestinae, flourished as the quote-unquote metropolis or capital city of Palestine. The two cities had various ongoing intellectual and cultural pursuits. Procopius of Caesarea was the preeminent historian during this era. He wrote about a fellow Palestinian, Jesus Christ, saying, quote, "Jesus, the Son of God, was in the body and moving among the men of Palestine, showing manifestly by the fact that he never sinned at all, and also by his performing even things impossible, that he was the Son of God in very truth." Unquote. Gaza was home to a famous school of rhetoric, just as renowned as the Library of Caesarea. The flourishing port life in the city led to many tourists from Greece actively comparing it with Athens. The city was represented by an Arabic bishop, while the city streets bustled with a variety of languages from across Africa and Eurasia. It was a truly stunning cosmopolitan city. In spite of its diversity and modernity, Gazans never lost track of their ancient traditions. They were huge fans of Julian the Apostate's moderate reign, and they also celebrated ancient pagan festivals like the Rose Festival of Gaza, or simply the Day of Roses. This holiday dates back thousands of years and was likely a Christianized interpretation of the Rosalia festival of ancient Roman times. Jennifer Hevelone Harper wrote about 6th century Gaza, saying, quote, "The city was a commanding cultural and economic center, known for its bustling marketplaces, its lavish theater and baths, its resplendent churches adorned with mosaics, and all the other amenities of a prosperous urban center. Gaza served as a key commercial center. Gaza served as a key commercial center, not only for its own province, Palestine I, Palestina Prima, but for the entire eastern Mediterranean. Local products, such as wine, dried fruit, and flax, were exported from Gaza to the rest of the Roman world, while wheat was imported from Egypt. In Palestine Secunda and Tertia, the Arab Christian Hassanids were under the rule of their greatest king Al-Harith V ibn Jabala, who ruled from 528 until his death in 569. The Phylarch of Phylarchs assisted Justinian throughout his Persian wars. It was largely due to Hassanid participation in the campaigns as auxiliaries and scouts that the Romans fought the Sassanids to a standstill. This war would rage on indecisively for decades until both powers, nearly bankrupt, were forced to call a white peace, returning the borders to their previous pre-war positions. Justinian I died in 565. He had managed to reforge a massive empire which encompassed most of Rome's former lands, but upon his death, the size of the empire proved to be one of its greatest weaknesses. Following Justinian, a series of subpar emperors would control the shaky realm until Maurice was chosen as the new emperor by Tiberius, who would soon pass away. Maurice was a writer and general who had written the treatise on Roman warfare during the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Remembered as the Strategicon, the treatise details the methods and stratagem most effective against Rome's many enemies. Maurice instituted major reforms in the military which would emphasize discipline and a return to the quote-unquote military glory of yesteryear. Many of his underlings were perturbed at these measures and the constant military campaigns. In spite of this, Maurice was successful in his military endeavors. This included a campaign against Persia in which Maurice successfully installed Shah Chosroes I to the Iranian throne. In 602, the rumblings against Maurice's reforms resulted in a mutiny within the army, which eventually spread to the general population. Attempting to placate the people, Maurice decided to abdicate in favor of Phocas, one of the rebel generals. Phocas proved that he was a more horrific monster than Maurice had ever been. He forced Maurice to watch as his 5 sons were executed before his own beheading. Chosroes I heard this news and immediately used it as the pretext for an invasion of Roman Armenia. The resulting Persian War would end with most of Palestine switching hands between 4 separate powers within the span of just 25 years. Following the collapse of the Byzantine military, Simon Sebag Montefiore tells us, quote, "The Persians, spearheaded by the mailed fist of their heavy cavalry, conquered Roman Iraq, and then swooped into Syria. The Jewish people of Antioch rebelled." Unquote. The Persians were commanded by a general known to history by his sobriquet, Shah Baraz, the royal boar. As he marched south into Palestine, 20,000 Jewish rebels supposedly joined him. The Persians and their Jewish allies stormed Jerusalem. Palestina Prima and Palestina Secunda were now totally in the hands of the Sassanids. They promised to return Aelia Capitolina to the Jewish peoples. They were forced to besiege Aelia once more in 614, and this time the Persians and Jewish Palestinians showed no mercy to the city's Christian population. Once they broke into the city, they massacred thousands of Christians, deported tens of thousands to Iran, and utterly destroyed the new church, St. James's Cathedral, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The new church would never be reconstructed. Additionally, the Holy Lance, the supposed sponge which touched Jesus' lips, and the true cross were all pilfered from these churches and sent to Iran to be displayed in the Christian churches there. They left a man named Nehemiah in charge. Nehemiah was the first Jewish sovereign of Aelia Capitolina / Jerusalem since the time of the Zealots and Bar Kokhba. However, it is incorrect to assume that this was the only attempt at rebellion by Jewish and Samaritan Palestinians. Throughout the 4th, 5th, 6th, and early 7th centuries, Jewish uprisings occurred in the region. Some were moderately successful and ended in embarrassment for the ruling Byzantine emperors. All of these uprisings, however, eventually floundered due to the military efficiency and cruelty employed by the Roman Byzantine armies. Besides Jewish uprisings, this era was most known for several Samaritan rebellions, which were all suppressed with ferocity and intense bloodshed. The Samaritan community in Palestine was utterly devastated and would never fully recover from this era's cruel state-sponsored violence. Nehemiah gave the Christians still living in the city a choice. It was a choice which had often been given to Jewish Palestinians: convert or die. In the subterranean sewers and pools of the city, Christians martyred themselves or they were forced to become Jewish. For 3 years, the population of the city was terrorized by Nehemiah and his Jewish fundamentalists. Then in 617, the royal board returned and expelled the Jewish people from the city, granting the governance of the city to the Christian population once more. Nehemiah attempted to resist, but he was captured and then executed. The Jewish population was now oppressed even more by the Christians, who set about restoring the Holy Sepulchre with Iranian funds. The Exarch of Africa, Heraclius the Elder, ruled in North Africa. His son was also named Heraclius. Heraclius the Elder was a longtime ally of Maurice, and he refused to allow the stupidity of Emperor Phocas to continue. He raised his flag in rebellion and sent his son to Constantinople with a fleet. Once he arrived, Heraclius gained the support of the city's population, and Phocas was thrown at Heraclius's feet. Heraclius asked him, quote, "Is this how you rule, wretch?" Unquote. To which Phocas responded, quote, "And will you rule better?" Unquote. Insulted by this, Heraclius beheaded Phocas with his own sword. He then ordered Phocas's genitals to be cut off, as Phocas was a known rapist. Thus began the rule of Heraclius the Great. He had many issues which needed to be addressed. In the south, Egypt was being overrun by the Persians. In the north, the Avar tribe, located in modern-day Hungary, ran roughshod over the European holdings of the empire. The only thing the Byzantines had going for them was their command of the sea. Using this to his advantage, Heraclius sailed to the Bay of Issus with 50,000 men and marched inland to defeat the royal boar in 623. The Persians regrouped and moved on Constantinople. Heraclius put his faith in the city's defenses and took his army into Persia directly. Persia called on the Avars to support their siege of Constantinople. The city was ringed by almost 200,000 Avars on its European side, while their Persian allies attempted to attack the city by sea. Heraclius was fighting in modern-day Iraq when he called on the Khazar tribe to fight by his side. The siege of Constantinople was bogging down, and Heraclius had convinced the royal board that the Shah was planning his execution. As a result, the royal board did not pursue the siege with the utmost ferocity. Another result of the secret alliance was the withdrawal of the royal boar from the active war front. He would rule Egypt and parts of the Levant until his death. The siege of Constantinople was over, and Heraclius could gather all of his men for an invasion of Persia. He crushed the Persian army which opposed him, and then colluded with factions inside Persia to overthrow Chosroes. Chosroes was placed in Byzantine custody, where his son was killed in front of him, before he was likewise executed. On March 21st, 630, Heraclius rode up to the gates of Jerusalem. He was now almost 60 years old, and completely exhausted by the decades-long war. He made his march through the city of Aelia Capitolina, and placed the true cross, which he had won back in the Persian peace deal, in the newly restored Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Heraclius demanded that practitioners of the Jewish religion be expelled from the city or forcibly converted to Christianity. At around the same time, a small cavalry raid from Arabia arrived in Palestine. At first, Heraclius and the Byzantine state likely thought nothing of the raid, as raids from Arabia were not infrequent occurrences. What they failed to realize, however, is that this small raid was ordered by a man named Muhammad, the prophet of the new religion of Islam. While the Sassanids and the Byzantines were shattered From the decades of futile war, Islam would move in with a zeal and change the religious and cultural landscape of the region forever. On the next episode of the Turning Tides podcast, the armies of the Prophet Muhammad and his descendants will take over huge swaths of land in a relatively short period of time, before changing the political and cultural landscape of the area for years to come. Before we end today's episode, I just wanted to say thank you to all the new listeners and subscribers, as well as those of you who have been with us from the start. We truly appreciate your support, and we hope you're getting new information as well as reliable sources from our show. We will be taking a short break before we continue with the 5th episode in the Turning Tides Palestine series, Acts. I hope you'll join us then to hear more. But until then, I hope you all have a great day.
If you like what you heard today, you can support us by donating on PayPal at Turning Tides Podcast 1. We would also appreciate it if you take the time to rate and review Turning Tides on whatever platform you use to listen, and share the show with your family and friends. It really helps us bring the show to more listeners. Thank you so much for the support, and thanks again for listening.